The timber harvest was an essential part of the long-term habitat management plan for Spring Island. We've been managing the island actively, specifically for habitat now for 25 years, thanks to the leadership that Betsy Chafin originally provided. When she brought in the habitat management team that comes every year and looks at Spring Island, they have been giving us recommendations about how to improve the quality of the habitat here on Spring Island. People may not realize it, but 70% of Spring Island was cleared and was cotton fields back in 1850. So for a majority of the forest on Spring Island, they relatively new, and when trees came into these abandoned fields, they all grew up at the same time and grew very quickly and became very crowded. And so because they started out as crowded forest, what has happened throughout the last 20 years is certain areas have been selected and the forest has been thinned. The idea is not to gain revenue from the timber, but rather to take out the smaller, thinner trees, allowing the larger, healthier trees space to grow. Because we've been doing that in certain areas for quite a while now, for 15 years, those trees are now much larger and much healthier than they would have been otherwise. There were certain areas, though, that we were not able to harvest. In one case, it was because it was all young live oak trees, and there's not a market for live oak trees. So no one was interested in harvesting that. An example of that area specifically is down on Little Neck as you go down approaching the campsite. In that particular place, the young live oaks that grew up were so dense and under so much competition that none of them could grow. And so for the last almost 20 years, we've been showing that place to our habitat managers, and they said, when are you going to thin it? But there was nobody to thin it. When we had the timber harvest scheduled that we've just completed, one of the conditions was that we were going to make sure that overcrowded young live oak forest got thinned so that the remaining trees could grow to full size. And that's what we did. It turns out the market has changed in the last 10 years in the fact that there's now a market for hardwood chips. And so we were able to get that forest thinned and marketed to be sold as hardwood chips. So that was a big accomplishment. There are other areas where 10 years ago the trees weren't large enough to be marketable. And so we had to wait for those trees to mature. And so there's some areas that we thinned that were pine forest that we thinned for the same reasons we had the other one, that we had thinned other areas previously. That allowed, again, the remaining pine trees, which were the larger ones, to now have space to grow. And in the case of the pine forest, we also wanted to make sure that there was light getting to the ground and allowed us to have a more rich forest ground cover. By rich, I mean larger number of species of grasses, native grasses, and forbs, wildflowers, and plants that are herbaceous that are important food items for wildlife. An area like that is one that you pass by as you head down toward the Great Salt Pond, still up on the hill near the Gillespie Trail. So those are two examples. An important component to a habitat management plan here, and specifically to a timber harvest, is that we also have to consider aesthetics. And so what we have done with every timber harvest is we've turned around and taken the profit and we've reinvested in that to clean up after a timber harvest. If this were a timber company, they would have left the tops of the trees to decompose, and it would have taken 5, 6 or more years before the debris left from the timber harvest had decomposed. We can't do that on Spring Island. We're in the real estate business as well as this is a home where everybody lives. So one of the things that happened with this timber harvest is that the logging crew then switched gears and became the cleanup crew. And they had a bulldozer with a rake on the front and went back and cleared out after the places that they've been. So our timber harvests are left much neater than a typical timber harvest. Having said that, there's always some debris left behind, and we continue to clean that out.
What about those
Hurricane
things?
Matthew put an interesting twist into things. Obviously, it was a highly destructive storm. You can see by the number of trees that fell over, but it could have been a whole lot worse. Um, I went through Hurricane Hugo in 1989, and that was a Category 4. And in that case, the trees snapped off. So when you came back, there was not a forest. All the pine trees that were really of large mature size were broken off at about 15 feet. The live oaks had been pruned from the top down, but in many cases, the forest essentially had to start over from scratch. You had to have young trees that were 10 years old or less wait for them to grow up. So we got a black eye on this one in terms of trees getting blown over. But as you can see, after we cleaned up, we still have an intact forest. So really, we were very fortunate. As everyone who's been out here during the hurricane cleanup period saw, it was the laurel oaks and the water oaks that blew over, particularly from the roots. Laurel oaks are fast-growing trees that have soft wood for an oak, and they're usually hollow by the time they're 70 to 90 years old. They're also shallow rooted. Those are the trees that came over, that blew over. When Hurricane Matthew occurred, we had already signed a contract with the timber harvest people. We thought we were going to do the timber harvest in the summer of 2016, but the timing didn't work out. So we had already scheduled it for May, June of 2017. When we saw that we'd had a hurricane and we saw the amount of blowover, we saw an opportunity to see if we could go ahead and get the logging crew here to start the timber harvest, because that would be an incentive to get them here. But at the same time to do the cleanup, because the logging equipment would be a huge asset for cleaning up the sides of the trees that had blown over. I also knew that many of the areas that normally they would be logging would be waterlogged after the hurricane, and since we were a higher well-drained location than some of these other areas, I thought there would be a pretty good chance that they might come ahead and see us while they waited for other areas to dry out. And thanks to Travis Folk's connections, we were able to get them here within 72 hours after the hurricane left the area.
That's amazing.
So then we became involved with cleanup. Now what's interesting from a cleanup perspective was that some of the areas that we were interested in trying to thin were trying to get rid of all these high densities of mature laurel oaks and water oaks, because those were species we're interested in thinning out. The hurricane did that for us. So instead of them coming to try to cut down erect trees, they simply came and had to saw them down and pick them up because they were already blown over.
It's tougher.
In some ways it is, yeah, but it certainly made it so that there were more trees that they were able to excavate. So some of the areas that they got thinned by the hurricane were actually going to be a benefit to us within the nature preserves, because it's allowing more light to get into some areas and giving us some more opportunities for management in the future in those places. So hurricanes can have very catastrophic effects, but if it's a small scale hurricane, as far as the forest goes, they give an opportunity for new growth by opening up gaps in the forest.
That's